at least 2 ligature marks around his neck.
This was a homicide. He died by strangulation.
His loved ones claim he didn't have enemies.
He was nurturing and caring.
I couldn't imagine that type of betrayal.
I said, something's up, more than meets the eye here.
But the clues point detectives to the last people anyone would have expected.
They got together and said, we got to get rid of him.
He was in love with her and wanted to end a toxic marriage so that they could be together.
She manipulated this whole thing. She was the puppet master.
November 23rd, 1995. It's Thanksgiving Day in Schenectady, New York. But instead of celebrating with her family, 30-year-old Stella Lacy is calling police to report her husband, Paul Lacy, missing.
She had seen Paul the previous evening. She went up to bed around 11:30. Paul was downstairs rummaging around the kitchen for something to eat and never came up to bed, which was not unusual. He would sleep on a couch or a day bed on the first floor or go out late, but not coming home that night or the next day was unusual because it was Thanksgiving Day.
It was very odd that Uncle Paul wouldn't be at Thanksgiving, you know. His life revolved around family.
The Schenectady Police Department dispatched somebody to her house to conduct an initial interview.
Officers ask Stella to walk them through the day leading up to Paul's disappearance.
She told the patrolman that Paul had worked Thanksgiving Eve during the day. Ron Faulkner, who was Paul's first cousin, was actually living in the house and had been renting a room from the Lacys. When Paul got home from work, she sent Ron and Paul out to get some bread for the stuffing and a couple other items. And she continued to make Thanksgiving dinner.
Stella says Paul and Ron returned from the store around 11 p.m.
There was a neighbor who lived kitty corner to Lacy's home. His name was Calvin Smith. And at this time, he stopped over and just to socialize with Ron and Paul, and she went up to bed.
Paul doesn't come to bed that night. The next morning, she believes he may have left to go to work. She had paged him. He doesn't come back, and that's what precipitates her initial filing of the missing persons report.
To go missing on Thanksgiving, it hit us all hard because it's like, we know Paul and he always come home. So this was abnormal.
It's not even 24 hours, but if someone's reported missing, they're put into a national database. In this case, there was a vehicle involved. It's 1986 Volvo with a New York plate on it. All this is entered into a database.
The patrol officer asked for a recent photo of her husband, Paul, and if there was any extenuating circumstances that she should know about.
She said he was not a drug user, but Paul was under a lot of pressure. They had some money issues. He lost his job, even though he got a new job at a local Coca-Cola warehouse. You know, they owed a lot of money. Additionally, she said he recently cashed out his 401k for about $8,000, but Paul wouldn't leave the family and the kids on a holiday. At this point, patrolmen interviewed neighbors, but we really didn't get any good leads.
His devotion to his family makes the disappearance even harder to explain. 2 days into the investigation, a tip comes in.
At about 2:30 p.m., the Schenectady Police Department gets a call from a person living 2.5 blocks from where the Lacys lived, saying that there was a car parked on a one-way street in front of their house, parked the wrong way.
There was a man sleeping in the car. The officers that responded made numerous attempts, pounding on the glass, knocking on the side of the car, and they felt that it was necessary to call for EMS.
They opened the door and tried to wake this person up. Not only was he obviously dead, he was nearly frozen.
They found no wallet, but they did find, by going through his pockets, an identification card. Then the police knew that this was Paul Lacy.
Paul Lacy was born May 12, 1964, in Albany, New York. He and his younger sister were part of a large extended family.
He was a loving brother. We always were watching cartoons. He used to take me to school. I was littler than him, so I walked slower, so I was pretty much led around, you know.
We had very strong mothers, and then it turned us into decent people.
Paul was always a happy kid. He always enjoyed life. Anything that he did, it was done because of his doing. What made him happy, that's what he did. Paul's father wasn't really in his life. I had to depend on the welfare system. But I was always going to take care of my kids.
After high school in the early 80s, Paul started working at a local market. He quickly rose to become a manager. It was also the place he met his future wife, Stella Close.
Stella and her family was in our neighborhood. Her dad was a hardworking man. Her mom was a stay-at-home mom, for what I could tell. So Stella had a stable home. She had dated a couple guys that were not as nice as Paul. He was nurturing and caring. He wanted to have somebody to love. She started coming around. And then next thing you know, they're getting married.
The young couple married in 1986. In the years that followed, Paul and Stella built a life together, including 3 beautiful children.
He decided to go into his career at Cargill, which is a flour mill at the Port of Albany.
Pretty much any job you got that was down at the Port of Albany, they paid you well.
Whatever his wife, Stella, wanted, he made it for her or got it for her. And it started with a car. Then he bought her a house, had a pool put in. He provided everything for that family.
And you know how it feels to not have a real father that you've been longing for. Therefore, you're going to be a stand-up man, and he decided to be that stand-up guy for his family.
Paul strove to be the best father he could be for his children, ages 9, 7, and 16 months.
Paul had 3 kids, a girl, a boy, a girl. That's what Paul wanted.
His heart was kind. He would always make sure whoever he did for, he was going to do his best by him. He didn't care who you was.
As far as Paul, his aspirations, each one was just a milestone. It became setting up for retirement, setting up for his children's education. So, yeah, his goals kept getting higher and higher.
But 2 days after Thanksgiving Day, 1995, Paul has been found deceased. At first glance, it's unclear how he died.
The keys were on the floor in the front seat. There was no broken glass anywhere. His clothes weren't disheveled like there was a struggle. There was no blood. There were no gunshots. There was no knife wounds.
While there are no obvious wounds on Paul's body, closer inspection reveals a telltale sign of foul play.
He had at least 2 rounds of ligature marks around his neck. He was strangled.
There isn't much room in the back seat of this car, this Volvo. So it would have been very difficult for whoever killed Paul to have strangled him from the back seat.
That would tell me it took a person of size and or strength to pull this off, and that it wasn't done in his car, it was done elsewhere, and then Paul's body was moved from the actual crime scene.
Strangulation is not a typical means of death in a robbery case. People who strangle other people usually have a personal relationship. It could have been by someone who was close to him.
Coming up, investigators learn about a recent feud.
Paul put his foot down and said no. And then that's when the whole rage came out.
And a possible suspect shifts the course of the investigation.
I said, we'll get to the bottom of this. And with his hand, he pointed to the kitchen floor and said, the bottom starts right here.
Two days after Paul Lacy was reported missing, his dead body has been found less than 3 blocks away from home. And investigators are trying to determine why.
There was no jewelry on him at that time, although he was known to wear 3 rings, which he did not have on. His pockets and his black jeans were turned inside out. It could be construed as a robbery gone bad or a robbery/murder. And the fact that Stella said that he carried a large amount of money on him at all times would point to that fact for sure. The only thing that they found was a pager on his belt. They downloaded the pager information. Stella told the responding officers that she did try paging him and he didn't respond. So it pretty much corroborated Stella's story.
After assisting the forensics people from the state police, it was determined that the body was going to be removed from the vehicle and would be shipped for autopsy. Then, investigators made the notification right away.
We asked Stella to come to the police department. She was given what is essentially a death notification. She started crying, seemed very upset. When she settled down, we said, now you need to help us help you and find out what happened to Paul. She's traumatized at this point. We found her husband dead. She's got 3 children. If she makes a mistake in a statement, we're going to let it go. But we do find some inconsistencies with what she tells us versus what she told the responding patrolman to report him missing. She said she saw him eat a salami sandwich at 11:30, which she did not tell the responding officers initially. She also said that Paul came up to bed on Thanksgiving Eve and got in bed with her, that he wanted to have sex, but she turned him down. Even though there was inconsistencies, we have to take that into consideration. Emotions, finite details that she may or may not have forgotten. So we don't push her on that, because you don't want to paint her in a corner yet until we know more.
This time, when Stella describes the events leading up to Paul's disappearance, she leaves out mention of their neighbor Calvin. But she has another theory about who might be involved.
As far as she knew, he never cheated on her, and she stated she never cheated on him, other than some financial pressures that they were under. On the surface, they had a good marriage. But Stella said that he did have an ongoing feud with a first cousin by the name of David Womack, who actually lived with them for a few months.
His older cousin needed him, and he provided a place for him, where the other family members were like, no, you're not staying with us. Paul was the one that was kind-hearted.
Stella says the arrangement quickly turned sour. And on November 3rd, 3 weeks before Paul's body was discovered, the conflict between the cousins escalated.
David would get into these rage-type arguments, stuff like that. He always had guns and stuff. But Paul was not like that. Paul wasn't a physical fighter. David Womack had an issue with his anger. So he probably thought he could bully Paul and stay there. Well, Paul put his foot down and said no. Told him he had to go. And then that's when the whole rage came out.
Paul kicked him out of the house. And according to Paul Lacy, his cousin Dave Womack sliced tires on Paul's cars.
While David was never charged in the tire slashing incident, Paul's allegations pushed their relationship to a breaking point.
Paul Lacy kicked his cousin Womack out of the house, but he allowed another cousin, Ron Faulkner, to rent a room in the house.
Investigators tracked David down for an interview.
Of course, he denied any involvement and said he hadn't seen Paul in quite a while. And in fact, definitely he didn't see Paul Thanksgiving Eve or Thanksgiving.
David claims he went hunting with his sons on Thanksgiving Day.
That was corroborated by friends and family alike. Although he was very suspect at this point, his alibi was corroborated.
With David ruled out as a possible suspect, detectives hope Paul's autopsy will give them a new lead.
The ligature marks left bruising and a distinctive pattern around his neck.
The medical examiner had determined that, in fact, this was a homicide. It was further determined that Mr. Lacy had died by strangulation caused by ligature.
This is not an exact science in terms of time of death. The fact that Paul had been, quote-unquote, frozen because of the weather and actually had been dead for some time, the ME cannot put, days on it. So we had to rely on the stomach contents and statement of Stella saying he ate a salami sandwich at 11:30 at night, Thanksgiving Eve. But Paul's stomach was empty, which would indicate that he hadn't eaten.
One of the last people to see him alive says that he is eating a sandwich or having a meal. The autopsy report is inconsistent with that. At this point, they're highly skeptical of those initial reports.
We still had a lot of unanswered questions. And now that Stella may or may not be involved, the pressure's on us to find other physical evidence or real evidence or eyewitnesses. But Paul's body was moved from the actual crime scene. Like, where did this actually happen?
Investigators have received Paul Lacy's autopsy report, which contradicts his wife Stella Lacy's story. But with little evidence to go on, police can't be certain of anything. They know the answers they seek likely depend on finding where the murder took place.
Well, how about his house? That's where he's supposed to be. And the last time Stella saw him, getting a search warrant's a pretty heavy lift, and it takes time. So we asked Stella for consent to search. Paul's first cousin, Ron, who lived there, they both consented. There's investigators throughout the house, upstairs, downstairs, in bedrooms and bathrooms and closets, drawers, private places. And at one point, while I was there, a man just walked into the back door into the kitchen. Didn't knock. We nodded to each other, said hello, And he immediately went to the turkey, the Thanksgiving turkey, ripped off a leg, started eating it, and I said, who are you? And he said that he was a neighbor, identified himself as Calvin Smith.
Calvin Smith was another man who was in the house that night that Paul Lacy disappeared. Stella neglected to mention that Calvin was there in her second interview with the police.
He said, yeah, this is really sad about what happened to Paul. I said, yeah, but we'll get to the bottom of this. And with his hand, he pointed to the kitchen floor and said, the bottom starts right here. They certainly got my attention. I said, what do you mean by that? He shrugged his shoulders. He was just as calm, cool, and collected as could be. He's eating a leg off a turkey dinner. And I took note of that. And I said, something's up. More than meets the eye here. You know, again, it's common sense. The speculation is that it happened here. I didn't want to put a lot of pressure on him right then because we didn't know, was he involved? Was someone in the house involved? So I just let it go, but of course I told the rest of the team.
After concluding their search, investigators' suspicions are reinforced by another tip.
There was an anonymous call that came in that the origin was never identified, but indicated that Paul Lacy had very poor eyesight and needed to wear his glasses all the time.
After we got that phone call from a friend, we immediately, started thinking, where are the glasses? There were no glasses in the car. So that tells you pretty much that he didn't drive there where he was found.
At that point, investigation goes back to the last place where he was seen alive with his wife, Ron Faulkner, and Calvin Smith.
We decided that we need to talk to Ron, Calvin, and Stella for the third time and bring them into the police department to talk to individually. They weren't under arrest, but we had a plan. We're going to interview them separately and be able to pull apart their stories or corroborate their stories. If someone's lying, it's hard to keep up a lie, and one lie leads to another. The inconsistencies that may or may not have meant something early on come into focus a lot more when you add them up. One or all of them are involved, and it did happen in the house.
Coming up, detectives expose a marriage in distress.
She finally admits, I've been having an affair. In fact, Thanksgiving was our anniversary.
And a shocking confession turns the case upside down.
She said she stood there for a few minutes staring, and it dawned on her that Paul was dead.
On November 27, 1995, 2 days after Paul Lacy was found murdered in the backseat of his car, investigators attempt to verify his final moments with the 3 people who saw him last. Paul's wife, Stella Lacy, his friend Calvin Smith, and his cousin, Ronald Faulkner.
We start by interviewing Stella. I can tell that she's nervous now. She's got a whole different demeanor. And she knows that Ron and Calvin are being talked to in adjacent rooms.
Contrary to what she initially told police, Stella admits she and Paul were having problems.
The marriage wasn't as rosy as she initially painted a picture of, and that Paul always wanted sex, and that was something she wasn't willing to participate in as much as he wanted to. He was a free spender, and they had filed Chapter 13 to protect the house and their vehicles, but he was spending money, according to her, hand over fist.
Stella says she began spending more time with Paul's cousin, Ron.
Ron, took care of a lot of chores around the house, was Uncle Ron to the 3 kids.
She told police that Ron was a breath of fresh air and could talk to her and she could talk to him and he would listen, unlike Paul.
She finally admits, in fact, she says, I've been having an affair with Ron for about a year. In fact, Thanksgiving was our anniversary. I asked her if she loved Ron, and she said actually she didn't, but house-wise, it was a good thing for him to be there for babysitting, cleaning, chores, etc. But it was just like a convenience. In terms of motive, she's having an affair with Paul's first cousin, Ron, who's living in the home and had been there for about 6 or 7 months. Secondly, there's a money issue, and she finally admits that Paul had 2 life insurance policies worth $50,000.
Stella admits that over time, she and Ron began to fantasize about life without her husband.
She told me that both her and Ron disliked Paul and even hated him, and they talked about getting rid of Paul.
Stella said she never thought that was being taken seriously.
But Stella says on Thanksgiving Eve, Ron surprised her.
She went up to bed. Paul came up a short time after and got in bed, wanted to have sex with her. She turned him down, and they were in bed for the night. Within a few minutes, maybe 15 minutes or so, she said that Ron yelled upstairs.
Ron yelled up the stairs that Paul had a phone call, and he suggested Paul come down and take the call. According to Stella, he was only gone a few minutes, and then Ron went back up the stairs and asked Stella to come down.
She walked in the room and just saw Paul face down in Ron's bedroom with a pink blanket over his head.
In the room besides Ron was Kelvin Smith, the neighbor that had been over to the house that evening. She said she stood there for a few minutes staring, and it dawned on her that Paul was dead.
They said, we got to get rid of him. She went back upstairs, got his shoes, pants, shirt, his belt, his pager, dressed him, all 3 of them, because it's not easy to dress a dead body. Calvin and Ron loaded Paul in the back seat of his Volvo. Stella said, I'll stay here and clean up the mess. She also said that Calvin had the rope they used to strangle him and told Calvin to get rid of the rope. And she told me that he flushed it down the toilet.
After they lowered Paul's body in the back seat, Ron drove the car. And he drove the car a couple of blocks away.
The 3 of them got together and said, here's what we're going to do. We'll make sure our stories match. And the biggest thing was that we're going to say it looked like a robbery. Here's Paul's 3 rings, which they removed from his hand after they killed him, and the money out of his pockets. Stella said, I'll wait till tomorrow to report Paul missing, and I'll beep him several times throughout the day so the police will think that I was really worried about him, that everything's going to be fine.
Stella's confession seems to explain everything, but detectives sense she is downplaying her involvement.
I don't know how true her confession is or not. I've got enough to believe that she's telling the truth to a point, but we need to talk to Ron and Calvin and put their stories together and see how close they are matching.
Coming up, the grisly details of the murder come to light.
He said, all right, I did it. I put the rope around his neck twice, and that was that.
And a confessed killer describes Paul's last moments.
He kisses Paul on the forehead and tells him, I'm sorry, but everyone can now be at peace.
New York authorities are investigating the strangulation death of Paul Lacy. While his wife, Stella Lacy, is naming her husband's cousin and neighbor in his murder, detectives are in other rooms with the two men trying to get their versions of the story.
I found out that Calvin was not admitting to anything, so I said, let me try. He denied being involved at all, so I asked him if he put his hands on the rope, and he said he did not. I said, Calvin, do you know what a rope is made of? And he kind of said, yeah, I guess. And I said, well, it's made of fibers. If you touch that rope, you're going to have these fibers embedded in your hand. Well, this is definitely not true, but Calvin seemed to be believing me. I told him that the PD had just purchased a fiber detection instrument. Now, this is 1995. Copy machines were brand new, big piece of equipment. Schenectady PD had purchased one recently, so I took him out of the interview room and I told him that was the fiber detection instrument. I lifted up the cover, as you would place a piece of paper there, and I said, we're going to stick your hand in that, and we're going to hit the detection button, or whatever I called it. And he put his hand down. You know, the bright light comes on. I said, don't look at the light. He pulled his hand away.
The investigator's ruse has the intended effect.
Right there at the copy machine, he said, all right, I did it. I strangled Paul. I put the rope around his neck twice, and that was that. I felt bad for Calvin that I had tricked him, but I can do that. I didn't interfere with his right to due process or convince an innocent person to confess to something he didn't do, all within the guidelines of the law.
According to Calvin, Stella wasn't an innocent bystander. He says he went along with the murder because she promised to give him $100 up front, along with a cut from the insurance payout.
Stella said, I'm going to give you some money. He thought maybe this is life-changing money. They also took the rings off Paul's fingers.
Calvin thought he'd get a lot of money for those 3 rings, and instead, all he got for the total for the 3 rings was $40.
When they question Ron Faulkner, he confesses as well, but with a different motive than Calvin.
He was in love with Stella and wanted to end a toxic relationship in the marriage so that they could be together.
Ron knew that her relationship with Paul was not what she wanted.
Ron said he'd do anything to make Stella happy. So while he was out running errands with Paul and Calvin the night before Thanksgiving, he decided to make the fantasy a reality.
Ron said, here's what we're going to do. Calvin, you get the rope, because you're a big guy, and you can hide behind my bedroom door. I'm going to yell up to Paul. When he comes in, you put that rope around him twice and just pull as hard as you can. Which, by Calvin's account and Ron's account, this is how it went down. Calvin just pulled as hard as he could for a couple minutes, and Ron actually jumped on top of Calvin to put more weight on Paul.
As he's dying, Ron leans forward, kisses Paul on the forehead and tells him, "I'm sorry, but everyone can now be at peace."
Paul's body was found on Saturday, November 25th. 3 days later, Ron, Calvin, and Stella were arrested. All three were charged with murder, tampering with evidence, conspiracy.
While they all face the same charges, investigators believe Stella was the driving force behind the crime.
Stella, I think, manipulated them both into doing it. She was the puppet master.
I was shocked that Calvin, Ronald, and Stella had murdered my brother over insurance money with Stella. Anything she wanted, my brother would have gave it to her. It was senseless that she would even go to those extremes.
I couldn't imagine that type of betrayal, that type of pain that you would inflict on someone that you care about for money.
Paul's family relies on prosecutors to exact justice. But when it comes to Stella, they have major concerns.
Although I think Stella orchestrated this, it's hard for a jury to put someone away for life, even though they planned it. We have to make sure we did our job and the evidence is enough to take it to trial. You build the best case, because you're going to get one shot at this.
In August 1996, Stella Lacy goes on trial for the murder of her husband, Paul Lacy. Her alleged co-conspirators decide to take plea deals instead.
Ronald and Calvin, they were facing a potential death penalty case. And sure, their attorneys advised them that their only shot to save their own skin by pleading to the lesser murder charges rather than face potential death penalty.
Calvin pled guilty to first-degree murder, was sentenced 25 to life. Ron decided to plead guilty to second-degree murder and also received 25 to life.
As part of his agreement, Calvin provides testimony against Stella. Prosecutors do not require the same of Ron.
He was in love with her and would never harm her.
Stella's demeanor during the trial was cold, very cold, stone-faced.
The defense strategy was that she did not participate in the murder, only became aware of it after the fact when Ron and Calvin notify her, and that her involvement was to help dispose of the body.
However, Calvin denies such claims. He testifies that Stella was the one that told him Paul's death needed to look like a robbery. He also claims that Stella wanted it to happen before the holiday.
Calvin indicated Stella had tried to do some pre-planning and that her representation that she was totally insulated from the actual homicide was incorrect.
Paul's cousin David Womack takes the stand as a witness. He testifies that Stella not only knew about the murder, she was the one who planned it.
His testimony was that he was approached by Stella and offered $10,000 to kill Paul.
Womack's statement shows that Stella had thought about this in advance.
But it doesn't seem to be enough for the jury.
Womack's credibility was terrible. He never reported to police that she had approached him, so, it looked like sour grapes on his part. The jury didn't believe his testimony. She was actually found not guilty of first-degree murder.
She was found guilty of criminally negligent homicide, tampering with evidence, and hindering prosecution.
She was sentenced 10 to 32 years in state prison.
The first reaction was upset, anger. We tried to let the justice system do their job, but it failed us.
I feel like Stella got a break. She should have did more time than anyone else because this was all her plan.
Of course, I was disappointed. I take that as a loss. We did our job. I think she manipulated this whole thing. The fact that she did not actually physically participate in the murder is tough, I think, for a jury to take it to the level to send her to prison for life.
Paul did not deserve to have his life taken away because of somebody's greed. He deserved better, and he didn't get that.
Paul had an infectious smile. He had a hug that would warm you to the bone. His generosity was unlimited. We still talk about him today. 30 years later, we keep him alive in our heart.
With Paul, it's like, I know he's safe. I don't have to worry about him. And that's the way I go forward with my life.
The wind over Schenectady, New York on the morning after Thanksgiving in 1995 cuts like broken glass, slicing through parked cars, empty sidewalks, and the sleepy silence of a town still digesting its holiday leftovers, and on a quiet one-way street just a few blocks from a home filled with the smell of turkey and family warmth, a car sits crooked against the curb, facing the wrong direction as if it was abandoned in panic or placed there by hands that no longer cared about order, and inside that car, slumped unnaturally in the front seat, is a man who looks like he has simply fallen asleep but whose stillness carries a weight that no sleep can explain. His head tilted slightly forward, his skin pale and stiffened by the cold, the glass around him fogged faintly from the night before, and when neighbors finally begin to notice what should not be there, what does not belong in an ordinary suburban morning, the first instinct is confusion rather than fear, because nothing about this scene screams violence at first glance. No shattered windows, no blood on the doors, no frantic signs of struggle, only a strange, quiet wrongness that grows heavier the longer one looks, until police arrive and begin the slow, careful knock on the window that becomes louder and more urgent with every passing second. And when there is no response, when the body inside does not move, does not react, does not return to life, officers force open the door and the cold air that spills out feels almost like it belongs to another place entirely. And it is in that moment, leaning into the vehicle, that the truth becomes unavoidable. This man is not sleeping, he is gone, and not recently gone in the way of a peaceful passing, but in a way that immediately triggers something deeper, something investigative, something that whispers homicide before anyone dares say the word out loud, because the stiffness of his body, the unnatural positioning of his limbs, and the faint but unmistakable marks around his neck tell a story that contradicts the calm suburban street outside. And as gloves are tightened and radios begin to crackle, investigators notice the absence of a wallet, the turned-out pockets, the quiet stripping away of identity in a way that suggests either robbery or something staged to look like one. Yet even that theory begins to fracture almost immediately when an identification card is found and a name is finally placed onto the face of the frozen man. Paul Lacy. Husband, a father, a worker, someone whose life until now existed entirely outside the violent imagination of this street corner. And the moment his name is spoken, the case transforms from a mystery into a rupture inside a family that had no warning, no final goodbye, no chance to prepare for what comes next, because just hours earlier, Thanksgiving was still supposed to be about family gatherings, plates passed around a table, children running through hallways, and a man who was expected to be there but simply was not, and that absence had already begun to create unease inside his home, where his wife Stella had picked up the phone and called police, her voice carrying the careful confusion of someone trying to explain a disappearance that did not feel like a disappearance at all, because Paul was not the kind of man who vanished without reason, not according to those who knew him, not according to the rhythm of his life which revolved around responsibility, routine and family obligation, and yet even as she spoke to officers, describing the last time she saw him, describing him downstairs in the kitchen late at night while she went to bed, describing a normality that should have ended with him following her upstairs, something about the story already felt slightly misaligned, like pieces of a puzzle forced together too quickly, and investigators, trained to listen not just to what is said but to what is omitted, begin to take note, because in missing person cases that end in death, the truth is often buried not in lies but in small inconsistencies that only become visible when the pressure of reality is applied. And here the pressure is already mounting, because within hours of Paul's body being discovered, the question is no longer where is he, but who would do this to him, and why would they place him here, so close to home, so close to the life he was supposed to return to. And as detectives begin their first sweep of information, they hear a consistent portrait painted by friends and relatives. Paul Lacy was not a man with enemies, he was not involved in dangerous circles, he was not someone who moved through life creating violence or attracting it. Instead he was described as gentle, dependable, almost quietly self-sacrificing, a man who worked, who provided, who built his life around his wife and children, and that contradiction becomes the first real source of discomfort in the investigation, because homicide scenes rarely belong to innocent narratives. There is usually friction somewhere, conflict somewhere, something that explains the breaking point, but here the surface is unusually smooth, almost too smooth, and yet beneath that calm exterior, officers begin to uncover small fractures, financial pressure mentioned in passing, a recently cashed-out retirement fund, a household that may have been struggling in ways not visible from the outside, and a marriage that from a distance looks stable but might have contained currents of strain running underneath daily life, and still nothing is concrete. Nothing is enough to point directly at a suspect, until the physical evidence begins to speak louder than the stories, because Paul's body tells a very specific truth. Ligature marks around the neck, multiple points of pressure suggesting a deliberate and sustained act of strangulation, not a sudden accident, not a random attack by a stranger in a chaotic struggle, but something controlled, something close, something personal, and that detail shifts everything because strangulation is rarely random. It requires proximity, time, strength, and intention, and in most cases it points back towards someone the victim knew, someone who did not need to overpower resistance from a stranger but instead had access, opportunity, and trust. And when investigators match that with the condition of the car, the absence of clear struggle, the lack of blood, the absence of broken glass, a troubling picture begins to form. Paul Lacy may have been killed somewhere else and then placed here like an object, his final resting place staged to delay discovery or mislead the direction of the investigation, and that possibility immediately expands the suspect pool inward, toward the home, toward the people closest to him, toward the last individuals who saw him alive, and suddenly Thanksgiving night is no longer a simple family holiday but a closed room of overlapping stories, each one waiting to be tested against the physical truth of what happened. And in that room sits Stella Lacy, the wife who reported him missing, the woman who last saw him alive, the person whose timeline becomes the backbone of the entire case. And yet even as she speaks with police, even as she describes a normal evening that ended with Paul downstairs and her upstairs in bed, there are subtle shifts in detail that investigators quietly record, small additions, small omissions, variations that might be explained by grief, shock, or the stress of sudden tragedy. But in homicide investigations, every inconsistency becomes a thread, and every thread eventually leads somewhere. And as detectives begin to pull, they also learn about other people present in the household that night. A cousin living under the same roof, a neighbor who came by to socialize, a shared Thanksgiving evening that now feels crowded with unexplained interactions and unaccounted minutes. And what was once an ordinary holiday begins to look like a tightly packed sequence of human proximity, any one of which could hold the missing piece of the puzzle. And as the investigation deepens, the urgency grows, because frozen bodies do not wait, evidence degrades, memories shift, stories solidify into defense mechanisms, And somewhere inside this growing complexity lies the simple, brutal fact that a man left his home and never returned alive, and the people closest to him may know more than they are saying. And that possibility, once introduced, changes the tone of everything that follows, because what initially looked like a disappearance now feels like a concealment, and what looked like a family waiting for answers now looks like a family sitting at the center of a crime scene that has not yet been fully understood. And as detectives stand in the cold November air looking at the vehicle that brought Paul Lacy back into public view as a corpse, they already sense that the truth will not come easily, that it will not come cleanly, and that behind the image of a devoted husband and father lies a final night that someone has tried very hard to rewrite. And the only question now is how many versions of that night exist, and which one will survive the scrutiny of evidence. Schenectady in the mid-1990s is the kind of place where life is supposed to feel predictable, where neighborhoods settle into routines so familiar that even small disruptions feel meaningful. And yet behind that surface of working-class stability and quiet residential streets, there are always lives unfolding in ways that no one outside the walls of a home can fully see. And for Paul Lacy, those walls held a life that on paper looked almost complete: a wife, 3 children, steady employment, and a trajectory that suggested not just survival but progress, the kind of slow upward climb that defines the American middle-class dream. And in conversations with people who knew him, one detail repeats itself like a refrain. Paul was not the kind of man who created chaos, he was the kind who absorbed it, who carried responsibility as if it were a natural extension of himself, who measured success not in personal indulgence, but in whether his family had what they needed. And that reputation becomes important now not just as memory but as contrast, because the man who ends up dead inside a frozen car on a Thanksgiving weekend is not someone anyone had mentally prepared to lose, and certainly not in this way. And to understand the shock that follows, one has to step back into the life that Paul built long before that final night. A life that began in Albany, New York, where he grew up in a household shaped more by absence than presence, where his father was not a stable figure, and where the responsibility of becoming the man of the house was something he learned early rather than later. And those who knew him as a child remember a boy who compensated for instability with reliability, someone who naturally gravitated toward caretaking, who looked after his younger sister, who moved through life with an awareness that things could fall apart and therefore needed to be held together. And that early conditioning becomes the emotional blueprint for the adult he would later become, because when Paul met Stella Lacy during his years working at a local market, he was not just meeting a romantic partner, he was stepping into a vision of family that aligned with everything he had been trying to build. And Stella herself came from a background that, at least from the outside, appeared stable: a structured household, a familiar suburban upbringing, and the pairing of the two of them made sense to those around them in a way that felt almost inevitable, as if two compatible narratives had finally intersected at the right point in time. And their relationship progressed with the quiet certainty of young couples who believe that love is not just emotion but construction, something that can be built if both people commit to it. And by 1986 they were married, beginning what would become nearly 2 decades of shared life, raising 3 children together, navigating the pressures of work and bills and responsibility. And for a long time, the story from the outside remained consistent with expectation. Paul worked, Stella managed the home, the children grew, and the household functioned as a unit of stability. But stability in long-term relationships is rarely static, and over time the pressures of ambition, money, and personal expectation began to reshape the internal dynamics of the marriage in ways that were not visible to friends or extended family, because Paul, driven by the desire to provide, entered a career path that eventually led him into industrial work at the Port of Albany, a place where labor translated into financial security, and with that stability came gradual improvements in lifestyle, incremental but meaningful: better housing, better possessions, a sense that hard work was producing visible reward. And in many ways Paul embodied the archetype of a provider who believed that effort would naturally translate into harmony at home. But as the years progressed and his responsibilities increased, something else began to shift, not just in his workload but in the emotional tone of the marriage itself, because the same man who had once been described as nurturing and steady began to show signs of strain under pressure. And those closest to the family began to notice moments that did not fit the earlier picture, moments of irritability, of emotional distance, of conflict that surfaced not as constant violence, but as intermittent eruptions, unpredictable enough to destabilize the sense of safety inside the home. And for Stella, these moments created a complicated internal conflict, because they did not erase the years of stability that had come before them, but they did begin to challenge the idea that stability was permanent, and like many long-term relationships under strain, there was a pattern that emerged. Periods of tension followed by periods of calm, cycles in which difficult moments were minimized, rationalized, or temporarily forgotten in the hope that they would not return. And in that fragile equilibrium, the family continued to grow, the children continued to mature, and Paul continued to push forward professionally, eventually transitioning from employment into a more ambitious path involving business development and entrepreneurial effort in agricultural chemicals, a field that demanded long hours and constant attention. And as the business expanded, so did the family's financial position, transforming them from working-class stability into significant wealth over time, culminating in a life that, by the early 2000s, placed them among the affluent residents of their community, living in a large home, managing investments, and participating in a social world that included events, gatherings, and a level of visibility that came with success. And to outsiders, this transformation looked like a success story in its purest form. A couple who had started young, worked hard, and achieved financial security through persistence. But within that success, subtle changes in Paul's behavior began to emerge. Changes that Stella would later describe in ways that suggested emotional distance, rigidity, and a growing preoccupation with control over financial matters, particularly money management, net worth calculations, and insurance planning, behaviors that at first might have been interpreted as responsible adulthood, but that gradually took on a different tone when combined with earlier signs of emotional volatility. And it is in this intersection of wealth and tension that the marriage begins to take on a more complicated shape, because wealth does not simply solve problems. It amplifies existing dynamics, and for the Cox household, the increase in financial stability did not eliminate underlying conflict, but instead intensified it in ways that were not always visible to outsiders. And Stella, moving through her public life, often maintained appearances even when internal strain existed, presenting a version of normalcy that allowed the household to continue functioning socially even as private conversations grew more difficult. And as investigators later reconstructed this period, they would find that the image of the perfect couple was less a contradiction of truth and more a surface layer over a deeper, more unstable reality, one that only became visible when viewed through the lens of what ultimately happened on that cold November morning when Paul was found dead, because the investigation into his death could not begin in isolation from the life he lived, and as detectives started mapping out relationships, routines, and behavioral patterns, they began to understand that the key to what happened in those final hours would not be found in strangers or random violence, but in the accumulated weight of years, in the slow buildup of financial pressure, emotional strain, and interpersonal complexity that had been forming long before anyone recognized it as dangerous. And in that sense, the setting of this case is not just Schenectady itself, but the interior landscape of a marriage that had evolved over nearly 40 years, a landscape shaped by loyalty, expectation, frustration, and the quiet erosion of certainty. And as investigators stood at the beginning of their inquiry, looking at a man whose life had ended in silence and cold, they were not just asking who killed Paul Lacy, but how a life that once promised stability could arrive at a point where its final chapter was written not in conversation or departure, but in secrecy, movement, and the deliberate removal of a body from the place where truth would have been easiest to find. Paul Lacy's life, when viewed through the eyes of those who loved him, does not begin with mystery or contradiction but with a kind of quiet emotional clarity that makes his eventual death feel even more dissonant, because everything people remember about him as a son, a brother, a husband, and a father points in one direction, toward consistency, toward effort, toward care that was expressed not in grand gestures but in daily presence, in the small repeated acts that build a life around others, rather than the self. And to understand why his absence on a Thanksgiving morning would ripple so violently through his family, one has to return to the early image of Paul as a child growing up in Albany, where instability at home forced him into an early awareness of responsibility, where the absence of a steady paternal figure meant that emotional grounding came not from authority but from adaptation, From learning how to read situations quickly, how to soften conflict, how to become the dependable presence that others could rely on when structures around them were uncertain. And this early formation of character is echoed again and again by those who knew him, who describe a boy who naturally took care of his younger sister, who moved through childhood not with rebellion or chaos but with a sense of quiet duty, as if he understood before most children do that stability is not guaranteed but must be actively maintained, and that understanding carried forward into adulthood, where Paul's personality did not shift dramatically but instead deepened into a more structured version of itself, particularly once he met Stella close in his late teenage years, a relationship that began in the familiar setting of proximity and shared community, and which quickly evolved into something that both families viewed as stable and appropriate, because Paul, even as a young man, already carried the traits that families often value in long-term partners: reliability, attentiveness, and a willingness to work toward a future rather than simply imagine one. And Stella, coming from her own structured background, appeared to align with that vision, creating what seemed to be a natural pairing that matured quickly into commitment. And by 1986, when they married, the sense among those around them was not one of surprise but of continuity, as if two lives that had already been moving in parallel had simply formalized their direction. And in the early years of their marriage, that perception held steady because Paul entered employment at a local market where he advanced into management, demonstrating the same persistence that defined his earlier life, while Stella managed the home environment, and together they built a household that soon included children, 3 in total, who became central to Paul's identity in a way that those close to him consistently emphasize, because fatherhood for Paul was not an abstract role but a lived practice, something he engaged in actively, shaping his routines around work schedules and family needs, ensuring that his presence when he was home was engaged rather than distant, and this pattern of devotion extended into his career decisions as well, when he later moved into employment at Cargill at the Port of Albany, a physically demanding job that nonetheless provided financial stability, and it was during this period that Paul's life began to take on the structure of long-term provider, someone who not only earned income but actively built upward mobility for his family, gradually transforming their circumstances from modest stability into increasing comfort. And friends and relatives recall this period as one of visible progress, where material improvements such as housing upgrades and family amenities reflected the consistency of Paul's effort. And Stella herself benefited from this trajectory, as Paul's earnings allowed for a lifestyle that expanded steadily over time, reinforcing the public perception that theirs was a successful marriage built on shared goals and mutual investment. Yet beneath that surface narrative, the emotional texture of the relationship was becoming more complicated, because long-term marriages often accumulate strain in ways that are not immediately visible to outsiders, and in Paul's case, that strain began to manifest during periods of high stress, particularly as he took on greater financial responsibility, and later pursued entrepreneurial ambitions that required long hours and constant pressure. And it is during these transitions that those closest to the family begin to recall moments that suggest a shift in emotional tone, moments where Paul's frustration surfaced in ways that contrasted sharply with his earlier reputation for calm dependability. And although these incidents were not constant, their intermittent nature made them more psychologically impactful, because they disrupted the expectation of stability without fully replacing it, creating a pattern where calm and tension alternated in a way that made it difficult to predict when conflict might arise. And Stella, navigating this dynamic, appears to have adapted by compartmentalizing these experiences, maintaining outward stability while managing internal uncertainty, a common response in long-term relationships where emotional disruption is episodic rather than continuous. And over time, the couple's life continued to expand financially as Paul's professional efforts eventually evolved into a business venture in agricultural chemicals, a decision that dramatically increased the family's wealth and repositioned them socially within their community. And by the early 2000s, they were no longer simply a working family but a financially successful household with significant assets, a large home, and a public image that reflected achievement and upward mobility. And in many ways, this transformation should have reinforced marital stability. Yet according to later reflections from Stella and others, it instead introduced new pressures, particularly around financial management, control of assets, and long-term planning, with Paul increasingly focused on documenting wealth, managing insurance policies, and monitoring financial security in ways that began to feel, at least to Stella, unusually intense. And while such behavior could be interpreted as prudent given their financial status, it also coincided with a period in which emotional distance within the marriage seemed to widen, creating a sense that the relationship was becoming more transactional in certain aspects, even as it remained publicly intact. And this duality becomes central to understanding Paul as a victim, because victims in domestic homicide cases are rarely defined solely by their public identity, but by the private dynamics that surround them, and in Paul's case, those dynamics included not only marital complexity, but also family entanglements that would later become crucial to the investigation, particularly the presence of extended relatives within the household and the blurred boundaries between family support and personal involvement. And as investigators would later learn, these overlapping relationships created a social environment in which trust, dependency, and familiarity could intersect in ways that obscured intention. And for those who loved Paul, especially his sister and close relatives, his memory remains anchored in a very different emotional register, one defined by kindness rather than conflict, by presence rather than absence, by the image of a man who showed up consistently in the lives of others, whether through work, parenting, or simple acts of reliability. And this is where the tragedy deepens, because the more complete the portrait of Paul becomes, the more difficult it is to reconcile that portrait with the circumstances of his death, a death that involved not only violence but also concealment, movement, and the deliberate effort to reposition his body away from the place where answers would have been most accessible. And in that contrast between life and end state lies the emotional center of his story, because Paul Lacy was not simply a man who died unexpectedly, he was a man whose identity was rooted in connection, and whose absence created not just grief but confusion, as those who knew him struggled to understand how someone so consistently devoted to family could be removed from it in such a sudden and silent way, leaving behind not only unanswered questions but a growing sense that the truth of his final hours would challenge everything they believed they knew about the stability of the life he had built. November 23, 1995 should have been nothing more than the quiet heartbeat of an American holiday home in Schenectady, New York, a night defined by the smell of roasting food, the soft clatter of dishes, and the familiar rhythm of family routines repeating themselves like they always had in the Lacy household. Inside the house, Thanksgiving preparations were already underway, the kind of domestic choreography that usually hides deeper tensions beneath its surface. Stella Lacy moved through the kitchen with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this 100 times before, checking the oven, adjusting trays, making mental notes of timing, while the house filled with the warmth of cooking food and the low hum of conversation. Her husband Paul Lacy was there too, but not fully anchored in the same way. He had always been a man who drifted between spaces, sometimes in the kitchen, sometimes in the living room, sometimes outside the immediate flow of the family's center of gravity, and that night was no different. He had been working earlier in the day and had come home tired, the kind of exhaustion that sits in the shoulders and dulls the eyes, but still he moved through his home, his children nearby, his cousin Ronald Faulkner present in the house as well, occupying a rented room that made him part guest, part family, part constant presence in the background of their lives. The neighbor Calvin Smith also drifted in and out that evening, as neighbors sometimes do in small tight-knit communities, where doors are not always barriers but suggestions. On the surface, everything appeared ordinary, even warm, but underneath that surface something had already begun to shift, subtle at first, like a change in air pressure before a storm. The official version of that night, as Stella would later present it, was simple enough. Paul came home, there were errands, there was food preparation, there were conversations, and eventually there was the slow winding down of a long day. But what investigators would later struggle with was not just what happened, but what was left unsaid, the omissions that formed gaps large enough for suspicion to enter and grow. According to her initial account, Paul had gone about his normal routine, even eating a late sandwich around 11:30 p.m., a detail that seemed harmless at the time but would later become a point of forensic contradiction. That night, as the household settled, Stella went upstairs to bed, leaving Paul downstairs in the kitchen area, a common arrangement in their marriage that friends and family would later describe as unusual only in hindsight, because Paul often stayed up late, sometimes sleeping on the couch or a daybed, drifting through the house rather than retreating into the upstairs bedroom. Around him the house still held life. The faint noise of movement, the presence of others, the expectation of tomorrow's Thanksgiving meal. But sometime after Stella went upstairs, The fragile normality of the evening fractured in a way that no one outside that house could yet see. What happened in those hours has been reconstructed only through later confessions, conflicting statements, and forensic inference. But at its core, the sequence of events suggests a moment where trust was weaponized inside a space that was supposed to be safe. At some point after Stella retired to bed, Paul was called or drawn downstairs again, possibly under the pretense of a phone call or some routine interruption that would not raise suspicion. He moved through his own home without alarm, because nothing in the environment suggested danger, and because danger, when it arrives from within familiar walls, rarely announces itself. In another part of the house, Ronald Faulkner and Calvin Smith were present, their roles at that moment still obscured by uncertainty, but their later statements would place them in proximity to what was about to unfold. The kitchen, which earlier had been a place of preparation and warmth, became instead the stage for a sudden and violent rupture. Paul's death did not occur in a chaotic public struggle, but in a confined, controlled space, suggesting planning or at least coordinated action. A ligature was introduced, a rope or similar material that would later leave unmistakable marks around his neck, and in that moment the dynamic of the house shifted from domestic familiarity to lethal confrontation. Strangulation is a slow violence, one that transforms seconds into unbearable stretches of time, and according to later accounts, Paul's resistance was overwhelmed not by chance but by force and positioning that made escape impossible. The attack was not accompanied by gunfire or stabbing. There was no loud explosion of violence that neighbors might hear, only the intimate physicality of one human being overpowering another in close proximity. As oxygen was cut off, awareness would have narrowed, the world collapsing into pressure, heat, and the instinctive struggle to survive. At some point during this process, the decision was made to conceal what had happened. This was not a crime that ended with death alone. It immediately transitioned into management of the aftermath. The body, still warm or only recently lifeless depending on the exact timeline, was dressed or redressed, suggesting deliberate staging. Clothing was adjusted, personal items were removed or rearranged, and the familiar identity of Paul as a husband, father, and worker was reduced to something to be transported rather than mourned in place. His rings, known to be worn regularly, were removed, and the contents of his pockets were disturbed, creating the appearance of a possible robbery scenario. The Volvo, his vehicle, became part of the staging process, a mobile container that would carry not just a body but a narrative intended to mislead investigators. At some point after death, Paul was moved from the interior of the home into his car, a task that required physical coordination and emotional detachment, or at least the suppression of any immediate emotional response. The act of placing a body into the back seat of a vehicle in the middle of a freezing November night is not casual or impulsive. It is deliberate, heavy with the weight of what it means to transfer a person from private death into public discovery. The car itself, later found parked improperly on a nearby street, became a silent signal that something had gone wrong, or had been made to look like it had gone wrong elsewhere. Inside the vehicle, investigators would later find signs inconsistent with a simple robbery. No clear struggle within the car, no obvious damage suggesting a fight inside its confined space, and no indication that Paul had been alive when he was placed there. The absence of broken glass, the lack of disarray typical of an abduction or street crime, all pointed away from a spontaneous attack and toward a controlled transfer after the fact. As the night progressed into early morning hours, the house itself began to settle back into silence, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of containment, of people attempting to align their actions with a story that would withstand scrutiny. According to later confessions, there was discussion among those involved about how the discovery should unfold, how missing person reports should be delayed or staged, how phone calls and pages might be used to create the appearance of concern. These decisions, whether coordinated in real time or rationalized afterward, reveal a psychological shift from immediate violence to calculated deception. By the time Thanksgiving morning arrived, Paul was no longer inside the house, and Stella would later report him missing, framing his absence within the familiar language of a man who had simply failed to return from routine movement. She described him last seen moving through the kitchen late at night, a detail that seemed plausible in isolation but would later be weighed against physical evidence that contradicted it. The most critical contradiction was not visible at first but would emerge through forensic examination. Paul's stomach contents did not align with the claim that he had eaten a sandwich shortly before death, suggesting that the timeline provided did not reflect reality. That discrepancy would later become one of the quiet turning points of the investigation, but at the moment of the incident itself, it was simply another fragment of a story still being constructed. Outside the house, Thanksgiving morning continued as it always does in suburban America, with families gathering, meals being prepared, and the expectation that loved ones will eventually arrive. But in Schenectady that year, one man did not appear, and the absence of Paul Lacy began as a simple missing persons concern before it would evolve into something far more complex. The car containing his body, parked only a short distance away, stood as an early clue that whatever had happened to him was not the result of random disappearance but of something far more contained and deliberate, something that had occurred in a space where he should have been safest, and where trust itself had become the final weapon. With Paul Lacy's death now confirmed, the case in Schenectady shifted into a different psychological space, where the questions were no longer about where he had gone, but about who had the access, the opportunity, and the emotional proximity to erase him from his own life and place him instead in the back of his car like an object abandoned in the cold. The investigation tightened around the last known hours inside the Lacy home, a space that suddenly felt less like a domestic environment and more like a closed system where every person present could potentially account for, or conceal, a piece of what had happened. Detectives returned to the house with a different mindset, no longer treating it as a place of absence but as a possible primary scene of death that had simply been cleaned, rearranged, or psychologically overwritten by those who remained inside it afterward. At this stage, three figures stood at the center of investigative attention: Stella Lacy, Paul's wife, Ronald Faulkner, his cousin and housemate, and Calvin Smith, the neighbor who had been present that evening and whose presence was initially treated as incidental but was now becoming increasingly significant. Stella was the first to undergo deeper scrutiny, not because she immediately appeared guilty, but because she was the one who had initiated the missing person report and therefore controlled the earliest version of events. In homicide investigations, the first narrative often carries disproportionate weight, and detectives know that whoever shapes that narrative first can influence the direction of the entire case. Her initial account described a familiar domestic evening, with Paul moving through the house, eating, and eventually remaining downstairs while she went to bed. But as officers compared her statements across interviews, subtle shifts began to appear, not dramatic contradictions, but adjustments in detail that changed the texture of the timeline. The timing of Paul's last meal, the exact sequence of who was awake, and the interactions between household members began to drift slightly depending on when she was asked and by whom. None of these inconsistencies alone pointed to deception, but together they created a pattern that investigators could not ignore. At the same time, Ronald Faulkner was interviewed separately. As Paul's cousin and a man living inside the home, Ronald occupied a unique position that blurred family loyalty and daily presence. His account of the evening emphasized normalcy, describing shared time, errands, and a general sense of nothing unusual occurring. Yet investigators were particularly interested in his emotional tone and his awareness of events after Paul's disappearance. Ronald appeared cooperative but careful, and in domestic homicide cases, that combination can sometimes reflect either innocence or practiced restraint. Detectives documented his statements meticulously, noting what he confirmed and what he avoided elaborating on, particularly regarding the later hours of the night when Paul was no longer visibly accounted for. Calvin Smith, however, became a more unpredictable variable. Unlike the family members, Calvin was not embedded in the household structure, but his presence that night placed him inside the same physical environment at a critical time. His initial statements suggested a casual visit, a neighborly interaction that involved socializing and brief conversation. But what stood out to investigators was not just what he said, but how seamlessly he inserted himself into the timeline without providing meaningful anchors of time or action. He could describe being there, but not precisely when he left, or what moments he remembered most clearly from the evening. That lack of specificity became more significant as investigators began mapping all three accounts against each other. The first real structural weakness in the initial narrative emerged when investigators compared the physical evidence from the autopsy with Stella's account. She had described Paul eating late in the evening, specifically referencing a sandwich around 11:30 p.m., but the medical examiner's findings did not support that timeline. Paul's stomach contents suggested he had not eaten at that time, creating a disconnect between the claimed sequence of events and his physiological state at death. In homicide investigations, this kind of mismatch does not immediately identify a suspect, but it destabilizes the reliability of every account tied to that timeline. Once one detail collapses under forensic review, everything connected to it becomes subject to reevaluation. As pressure slowly increased, detectives began to re-interview all three individuals, this time focusing not only on what happened, but on who was present in each moment, and how movement through the house was structured that night. The Lacy residence itself became a map of potential interactions, with upstairs and downstairs spaces representing different zones of memory and access. Investigators paid particular attention to the kitchen and adjacent rooms, since these were the last confirmed areas where Paul had been seen alive within the household narrative. The more they examined the layout, the more they began to consider the possibility that the killing had occurred inside the house rather than outside it, followed by a coordinated effort to relocate the body and stage the vehicle scene. During these re-interviews, a critical shift occurred in Stella's narrative. Under continued questioning, she began to introduce emotional and relational tension into her account, describing a marriage that was under strain, not just financially but personally. She spoke about arguments, emotional distance, and dissatisfaction that had not been fully expressed in her earlier statements. This was not yet a confession, but it was a widening of the narrative space, where motives and interpersonal dynamics began to surface more explicitly. At the same time, she referenced Ronald more frequently in ways that suggested increased emotional reliance, describing him as someone who was present, helpful, and attentive in ways she felt Paul was not. These descriptions, while still framed as context, subtly repositioned Ronald from background family member to emotional participant in the household dynamic. Detectives, however, were not yet ready to draw conclusions about motive. They were still trying to establish sequence, and sequence in this case was deliberately obscured by overlapping testimonies. One of the most important early breakthroughs came from the realization that Paul's body had been moved, not just from one room to another, but from an internal space to a completely separate external location. The absence of blood or clear struggle in the vehicle strongly suggested that death occurred elsewhere, meaning that whoever placed him in the car had done so after the fact. This single inference narrowed the scope of investigation dramatically, because it required access to both the victim and the vehicle during a window of time when others were present but unaccounted for in precise detail. As investigators expanded their analysis, they also began examining potential motives more systematically. Financial strain was one possibility, given the mention of debts and insurance policies, but at this stage there was no confirmed evidence linking any single individual directly to financial gain as a driving factor. Instead, attention increasingly shifted toward interpersonal dynamics within the home. The presence of Ronald in the household was re-examined not just as a logistical arrangement, but as a potential emotional and relational factor that could influence decisions made inside the home during a moment of conflict or escalation. Calvin's role remained ambiguous, but his placement in the timeline made him increasingly difficult to exclude. Even when his statements did not directly implicate him, his inability to clearly anchor himself in time created investigative discomfort. Detectives noted that in cases involving multiple suspects, even passive presence can become active participation when events escalate rapidly and decisions are made collectively under pressure. At this stage, however, no one had yet broken, no confession had been obtained, and no physical evidence directly tied any individual to the act of strangulation itself. What emerged instead was a tightening circle of psychological pressure, where each interview added weight not by revealing clear truth, but by eliminating certainty. Stella's story began to shift from purely procedural description into emotional explanation. Ronald's account remained consistent but sparse, and Calvin's narrative hovered in the background with gaps that became more noticeable with each retelling. Detectives understood that in cases like this, truth often does not arrive in a single moment of revelation, but in the gradual collapse of contradictions when individuals are separated and confronted with the impossibility of maintaining a unified false timeline. By the end of this phase, investigators had not yet reached a definitive answer, but they had achieved something equally important. They had narrowed the universe of possibility. Paul Lacy did not vanish into randomness, nor was he taken by an unknown predator outside his home. Instead, every path of evidence pointed back toward the same enclosed environment, the same night, and the same group of individuals whose lives were already intertwined with his in ways that now carried lethal consequences. The breakthrough in the Paul Lacy investigation did not arrive like a sudden explosion of truth, but rather like the slow cracking of a dam already under invisible pressure, where every small inconsistency that had once been dismissed as confusion or stress began to align into a pattern that investigators could finally recognize as intentional. After days of separate interviews, reconstructed timelines, and careful comparison of statements, detectives reached a point where the story being told by the people inside the Lacy home could no longer hold its own weight. It was not one single contradiction that broke the case open, but the accumulation of many small fractures, a meal that did not fit the autopsy, a timeline that shifted depending on who was speaking, and a body that had clearly been moved after death in a way that suggested coordination rather than panic. The first real turning point came when investigators stopped treating each account as an isolated memory and began layering them together like transparent sheets, revealing overlaps that had previously been invisible. When Stella, Ronald, and Calvin were questioned separately again, their stories still appeared superficially similar in structure, but the emotional and logistical gaps between them had widened. Stella's narrative now included more emphasis on relational dissatisfaction and emotional dependence on Ronald, while Ronald continued to present himself as a passive figure within the household, and Calvin remained the least anchored, offering fragments of presence without precise emotional context. Detectives began to see not just three accounts of the same night, but three perspectives shaped by different levels of involvement in the same concealed event. What changed everything was the realization that the staging of Paul's body in the Volvo was not a spontaneous act of panic, but a coordinated decision made after death had already occurred. The positioning of the body, the removal of personal items such as rings, and the absence of struggle inside the vehicle pointed to a controlled process rather than chaos. This meant that whoever participated in moving Paul had time to think, communicate, and decide how the scene would appear to outsiders. Once investigators accepted this, the focus shifted from what happened to Paul to who had the time and presence to manage what happened to Paul afterward. That shift narrowed the field dramatically. Pressure increased during subsequent interviews, and it was during this phase that Stella's account began to change in a more significant way. She moved from describing confusion and absence to acknowledging emotional distance within the marriage, and then further into describing the presence of tension that had been building over time. More importantly, she began to describe interactions involving Ronald in a way that suggested emotional intimacy beyond what had been previously disclosed. Investigators did not rush this development, but they recognized it as a critical psychological opening. In homicide cases involving domestic environments, emotional realignment often precedes factual disclosure, because individuals begin to justify their actions internally before they articulate them externally. As the interviews progressed, Stella eventually reached a point where she began to describe not just conflict, but an alternative emotional structure within the household, one in which Ronald played a more central role in her daily life than Paul did. She described frustration in her marriage, financial strain, and a growing sense of emotional dissatisfaction that she claimed Paul did not address. These admissions, while still partial, reframed the household dynamic from a stable family unit into a system of unresolved tension, dependency, and shifting emotional alliances. Detectives listened carefully, aware that motive alone does not establish guilt, but it often explains why boundaries were crossed. The most critical moment in Stella's evolving statement came when she began to describe a scenario that placed Paul's death inside the house, rather than outside it. According to her revised account, the events of that night involved Paul being called downstairs under the assumption of something routine, after which he never returned upstairs. She described walking into a situation where Paul was already unresponsive, his body present in a room downstairs, and Ronald and Calvin both present at the scene. At this point, her narrative shifted from ambiguity into partial admission, acknowledging that decisions were made after Paul's death about how to handle the situation, including the removal of his body and the effort to make his death appear like a robbery. This was the first moment investigators heard a structured explanation that accounted for both the death and the staging in a single sequence. According to her statement, once it became clear that Paul was dead, panic and calculation merged into immediate action. Clothing was adjusted, personal items were removed, and the decision was made collectively to move the body into the vehicle. Stella described staying behind briefly to clean parts of the scene while Ronald and Calvin handled the physical movement of the body. The rope used in the strangulation, she claimed, was later disposed of, and steps were taken to ensure that physical evidence would not immediately point back to the house. At this stage, detectives treated her statement cautiously. It provided a framework but not yet independent verification. The most significant development came when Calvin Smith, under separate pressure during questioning, broke from his earlier denials. His confession did not begin with full detail, but with an admission of participation. He initially acknowledged being present during the final moments of Paul's life, and then gradually expanded his account to include physical involvement in the strangulation. According to his statement, he was positioned in a way that allowed him to restrain Paul using a ligature, acting in coordination with Ronald, who was also physically involved. The description he provided was not of a chaotic struggle, but of a coordinated act carried out in a confined space, with roles implicitly assigned and executed in sequence. Calvin's confession introduced a critical psychological element: the idea that participation was justified by promises of financial reward and a belief that the outcome would benefit those involved. He described being told that the situation would ultimately lead to financial gain through insurance, and that the death would be made to appear as something other than murder within the home. Whether these motivations were accurately recalled or shaped under pressure, they nonetheless provided investigators with a motive structure that combined emotional manipulation with perceived financial incentive. Shortly after Calvin's admission, Ronald Faulkner also shifted his position. His account differed in tone and framing, but ultimately confirmed involvement in the events leading to Paul's death. Ronald's narrative leaned more heavily on emotional justification, describing a relationship with Stella that he believed was meaningful and claiming that he saw Paul as an obstacle to a future he believed was possible. He described the events of the night as unfolding in a way that escalated beyond intention into irreversible action, but he did not deny participation in the physical restraint and subsequent movement of the body. In his version, he attempted to frame his actions as driven by emotional attachment rather than premeditated financial gain. With both Calvin and Ronald now providing accounts that placed them inside the act itself, the investigative structure of the case solidified. Stella's role became the subject of deeper scrutiny, not only as a participant in the aftermath, but as a potential initiator of the plan itself. Calvin's statements suggested that discussions had occurred prior to the killing regarding how Paul's death would benefit those involved, particularly in relation to insurance. Ronald's statements, while less financially focused, still acknowledged coordination and shared intent in managing the outcome. Investigators now had a converging narrative from three separate sources, each shaped by self-interest but overlapping in key structural points. Paul was killed inside or immediately adjacent to the home environment. The act involved multiple participants, and the aftermath was deliberately staged to mislead investigators into believing a robbery had occurred. The inconsistencies that had once slowed the investigation were now being reinterpreted as indicators of coordinated concealment rather than confusion. The final confirmation came when forensic and circumstantial evidence aligned with the confessions. The absence of defensive damage inside the vehicle, the positioning of the body, and the mismatch between reported timeline and physiological evidence all supported the conclusion that Paul had been killed before being placed in the car. The rope marks around his neck provided physical confirmation of ligature strangulation, consistent with the described method of restraint. Even details such as the missing rings and disturbed pockets now fit within a broader staging effort, rather than random robbery. By the time investigators consolidated these findings, the case had fundamentally transformed. What began as a missing person report had become a coordinated homicide involving multiple individuals within the victim's immediate personal and domestic circle. The breakthrough was not a single piece of evidence, but the collapse of separation between narratives that could no longer exist independently. Each confession reinforced the others, not because they were identical, but because their contradictions still pointed toward the same central reality. Paul Lacy did not disappear into randomness or external violence. He was removed from his life by people who knew him, inside a space he trusted, and the final truth emerged only when the pressure of separation made it impossible for those involved to maintain the illusion of silence. By the time the case of Paul Lacy reached the courtroom in Schenectady, The emotional weight of everything that had been uncovered during the investigation had already settled heavily on everyone involved, as if the truth itself had been slowly extracted over months of interrogations, confessions, and reconstructed timelines until nothing remained but a sequence of irreversible decisions. The trial did not begin with shock for the investigators, who had already lived inside the details of the case for years, but it did begin with a kind of collective reckoning for the community that had once seen the Lacy family as stable, successful, and outwardly ordinary. The image of Paul Lacy as a devoted father and hardworking provider stood in stark contrast to the narrative that had emerged during the investigation, where betrayal, emotional entanglement, and calculated decisions had replaced the assumptions of normal family life. Stella Lacy stood at the center of the courtroom proceedings, not physically alone but psychologically isolated, as the weight of the prosecution's case gradually unfolded around her. The state's argument was built on the convergence of testimony from Calvin Smith and Ronald Faulkner, forensic evidence from the autopsy, and the reconstructed sequence of events that placed Paul's death inside the domestic environment, rather than in an external setting. Prosecutors described a coordinated act that began not in panic but in planning, arguing that the events of November 23 were not spontaneous but structured in a way that required multiple participants to carry out both the act of killing and the subsequent staging of the scene. Calvin Smith's testimony became one of the central pillars of the prosecution's case. He described in detail how he was involved in the physical restraint of Paul using a ligature, explaining how the act was not carried out in isolation but with coordination from Ronald Faulkner, who was also present and actively participating. His account was graphic in its simplicity, not theatrical but methodical, describing how force was applied until Paul stopped resisting, and how the aftermath immediately transitioned into discussion about how to conceal what had occurred. Calvin's description of being promised financial gain added a layer of motive that prosecutors used to frame the crime as both emotionally and economically driven, a combination that reflected manipulation and perceived opportunity. Ronald Faulkner's testimony, while less rigid in structure, reinforced key aspects of Calvin's account. He acknowledged his involvement but framed it through emotional justification, describing his relationship with Stella as the emotional catalyst that distorted his judgment. He portrayed the events not as premeditated murder in his mind, but as an escalation of intent that became irreversible once the situation unfolded inside the home. Despite this framing, his admission still placed him directly within the chain of actions that led to Paul's death and the subsequent movement of his body. He confirmed that decisions were made after Paul was already deceased regarding how to handle the scene, including efforts to make the death appear as a robbery. The prosecution's strategy focused heavily on dismantling the defense's attempt to distance Stella from direct physical participation in the killing. While there was no dispute that she did not physically strangle Paul, the argument centered on whether she orchestrated or encouraged the events that led to his death, and whether she actively participated in the cover-up afterward. Prosecutors introduced evidence suggesting that discussions about Paul's life insurance policies had occurred within the context of frustration and resentment, and that financial strain had been used as part of the emotional environment that shaped decisions among all three individuals involved. One of the more damaging elements for Stella came from Calvin's testimony, where he described her as actively involved in shaping the post-crime narrative. He stated that she was the one who emphasized the need for the scene to resemble a robbery, and that she coordinated aspects of the cleanup and staging after Paul's death. According to his account, she was not a passive observer who discovered the situation after the fact, but someone who immediately engaged in managing the consequences and directing how the story would be presented to outsiders, including law enforcement. The defense, however, attempted to reframe Stella's involvement as reactive rather than initiatory. They argued that she was a traumatized spouse who discovered her husband's death unexpectedly and became entangled in the actions of others who had already committed the crime. They emphasized emotional shock, confusion, and the chaotic nature of the hours following Paul's death, suggesting that any inconsistencies in her statements were the result of trauma rather than deception. The defense also attacked the credibility of Calvin Smith, highlighting the circumstances of his confession, including the investigative tactics used during his interrogation and the possibility of coercion or psychological pressure influencing his statements. A particularly controversial moment in the trial came when Paul Lacy's cousin, David Womack, testified. He claimed that Stella had previously discussed ideas related to harming Paul, and even suggested that she had approached him with an offer in the past. His testimony painted a picture of premeditation and long-term planning, but it was met with skepticism by the defense due to his lack of prior reporting and the timing of his claims. The prosecution used his statements to support the broader theory of intent, while the defense argued that his credibility was compromised by personal grievances and retrospective interpretation. Throughout the trial, Stella maintained a composed but emotionally restrained demeanor. Observers described her as distant, often expressionless, her reactions subdued even when explicit details of her husband's final moments were described in court. This emotional presentation was interpreted differently by each side. The prosecution suggested detachment consistent with guilt and involvement, while the defense framed it as a psychological coping mechanism in response to trauma and prolonged legal pressure. As the jury listened to the conflicting narratives, the central question gradually narrowed from what happened to Paul Lacy to what role, if any, Stella Lacy played in directing or facilitating those events. The physical act of strangulation was no longer in dispute. The focus had shifted entirely to intent, coordination, and responsibility. The legal challenge lay in separating emotional influence from criminal conspiracy, a distinction that often determines outcomes in cases involving multiple participants and overlapping relationships. When the verdict was finally delivered, the courtroom did not erupt into chaos, but instead fell into a heavy stillness that reflected the complexity of what had just been decided. Stella Lacy was acquitted of first-degree murder, meaning the jury did not find sufficient proof of intentional, premeditated orchestration of the killing at the highest level charged. However, she was found guilty on lesser charges, including criminally negligent homicide, tampering with evidence, and hindering prosecution. The outcome reflected a legal compromise between competing narratives, acknowledging her involvement in the aftermath and her role within the broader sequence of events, while stopping short of fully accepting the prosecution's theory that she was the primary architect of the murder. The sentencing phase brought the emotional dimension of the case into sharper focus. Paul's family expressed profound disappointment, feeling that justice had not fully captured the extent of betrayal they believed had occurred. They viewed Stella not merely as a participant in a legal sense, but as a central emotional figure whose actions had enabled the destruction of Paul's life. For them, the distinction between direct and indirect involvement carried less moral weight than the outcome itself. Stella was ultimately sentenced to a prison term ranging from 10 to 32 years, a punishment that reflected the court's determination that she bore responsibility, but not at the highest level of culpability established for the crime. Calvin Smith and Ronald Faulkner, having already accepted plea agreements, received sentences of 25 years to life in similar terms, solidifying their legal responsibility as direct participants in the killing. As the proceedings concluded, the courtroom atmosphere reflected not resolution but fragmentation. Each side left with a different interpretation of justice. For the prosecution and investigators, the case represented a successful dismantling of a concealed domestic homicide involving manipulation and coordination. For the defense and parts of the public, it represented a more ambiguous outcome, where emotional complexity and relational dynamics complicated the boundaries of legal guilt. Outside the courtroom, the legacy of Paul Lacy's death remained defined by contradiction. A man described universally as kind, hardworking, and devoted, whose life ended not through external violence but within the confines of his closest relationships. The justice delivered in court provided legal closure, but the emotional reality for those who knew him remained unresolved, marked by the lingering difficulty of reconciling the image of a loving family with the reality that unfolded behind closed doors on a Thanksgiving night that would permanently fracture everything that came after it. In the aftermath of the trial, the quiet streets of Schenectady seemed unchanged on the surface, yet for those who had followed the case closely, every familiar corner now carried a different weight, as if the town itself had learned something dark about what can hide behind ordinary walls and polite routines. The house where Paul Lacy once lived, once filled with the rhythm of family life, stood as a reminder that even the most stable-looking homes can conceal fractures deep enough to break a life in an instant. For investigators, the case became one of those files that never truly closes in the mind, because the answers were not hidden in a complex web of unknown strangers or random violence, but in the intimate space of a marriage, in the slow accumulation of resentment, pressure, and emotional distance that no outsider could easily see. What made the case linger was not only the brutality of strangulation or the cold logistics of moving a body to stage a false narrative, but the psychological transformation it revealed in people who once appeared ordinary, even dependable. Paul had been described by everyone who knew him as steady, generous, and deeply committed to his family, a man whose identity was built on providing, protecting, and enduring. That image made his death feel even more disorienting, because it challenged the comforting assumption that goodness offers protection, that devotion is somehow rewarded with safety. Instead, his story exposed how vulnerability often exists in proximity to trust, and how trust, once weaponized, becomes the most dangerous force in a person's life. As investigators and prosecutors reflected on what happened, they recognized that the crime was not simply about a moment of violence, but about a breakdown in moral boundaries that had been eroding long before Thanksgiving 1995. The financial strain, the emotional disconnect, the hidden tensions, and the shifting alliances inside the household all formed a pressure system that eventually collapsed inward. In hindsight, there were warning signs scattered across years, but none of them pointed clearly to murder on their own, which is what made the eventual outcome so difficult to prevent and so haunting to reconstruct. For Paul's family, the trial offered structure but not closure, because even when the legal system assigns responsibility, it cannot restore the sense of disbelief that someone so close could be involved in such a betrayal. They were left navigating a world where memories of laughter, holidays, and shared milestones now coexisted with images of a courtroom and testimony, describing a final act of violence carried out not by a stranger, but by people who had once sat at their table. The emotional contradiction of that reality became a lifelong burden, because grief in such cases does not follow a linear path. It loops back through moments of memory that suddenly feel contaminated by knowledge that was not present at the time. For the investigators, the case also reinforced an uncomfortable truth about domestic homicide investigations, which is that the most obvious emotional narratives are often misleading. At first, suspicion naturally drifted toward financial motives, missing persons scenarios, and potential external threats, because those explanations fit a conventional pattern of crime. Yet as evidence accumulated, that pattern dissolved, replaced by a more complex and uncomfortable reality involving shared responsibility, influence, manipulation, and shifting intent among individuals who were not unified by a single motive, but by overlapping desires and rationalizations. The investigative process revealed how easily truth can be fragmented when multiple people are involved, each constructing their own version of events to minimize personal accountability. Even when confessions were obtained, they did not align perfectly, leaving behind contradictions that forced investigators to piece together a composite narrative rather than a single clean account. That uncertainty became part of the case's legacy, because it highlighted the limits of certainty in human behavior. In prison, the consequences continued in different forms, as those convicted adjusted to long sentences that reduced their world to institutional routines and constrained interactions, while the broader public slowly moved on. Yet for those directly affected, especially Paul's children, the passage of time did not erase the underlying absence. Instead, it reshaped it, turning loss into something quieter but more permanent, a background presence in every milestone that followed. Growing up without a father who had been so central to their early life meant reconstructing identity through fragments of memory and stories told by others, each recollection carrying both warmth and pain. Over time, they learned to hold two versions of the past at once, one that belonged to childhood innocence and another shaped by adult understanding of what had actually occurred. That duality is one of the most enduring effects of such crimes, because it forces survivors to continuously reinterpret their own history. The broader community response also evolved as the years passed. What began as shock and disbelief gradually turned into reflection about domestic violence, emotional coercion, and the hidden nature of coercive relationships that do not always fit public stereotypes. People who once thought of the case as an isolated tragedy began to recognize patterns that exist in many households, but remain unseen, until they escalate into irreversible outcomes. The idea that violence can emerge not from sudden external intrusion, but from internal relational decay became an important, if uncomfortable, lesson. It challenged assumptions about safety, about how well we can truly know those closest to us, and about the silent thresholds that can be crossed long before any visible crisis appears. In reflecting on Paul Lacy's life, those who knew him often returned to the same qualities: consistency, kindness, and a deep sense of responsibility. Those traits, while admirable, also raise difficult questions about how selflessness functions in relationships where imbalance exists. The expectation that patience and generosity can stabilize emotional instability sometimes delays necessary confrontation with dysfunction, allowing harmful dynamics to persist under the surface of normal life. The tragedy of Paul's story lies partly in that contradiction, where commitment to family and hope for stability may have unintentionally delayed recognition of danger. Yet it is important not to reduce his life to the circumstances of his death, because that would erase decades of meaning, relationships, and contributions that defined him long before the crime occurred. His legacy, as remembered by family and friends, is not solely one of victimhood but of presence, of a person who shaped the lives of others through care and consistency. The final reflection that emerges from this case is not a simple moral conclusion, but a layered understanding of how human relationships can contain both love and harm, sometimes in ways that remain invisible until it is too late to intervene. Justice in the legal sense was achieved through convictions and sentencing, but justice in the emotional sense remains incomplete, because no verdict can fully account for the loss experienced by those left behind. What remains is memory, fragmented but persistent, and the ongoing effort by those who loved Paul to preserve his identity beyond the circumstances of his death. In telling this story, the goal is not to sensationalize the violence, but to acknowledge the complexity of what led to it, and the enduring impact it has had on everyone connected to it. The silence that followed the case is not empty. It is filled with questions that continue to resonate about trust, responsibility, and the fragile structures that hold everyday life together until the moment they do not. Long after the legal system closed the file on the Lacy case, what remained was not an ending but a slow unfolding of consequences that continued to echo through the lives of everyone touched by the crime, as if the moment of violence had fractured time itself and left each person carrying a different version of what happened, shaped by memory, guilt, and the unbearable knowledge of what had been hidden in plain sight. In Schenectady, the case gradually faded from front-page attention, replaced by newer tragedies and other names, yet for those who had lived inside its orbit, there was no such thing as moving on in the simple sense. The house where Paul once lived did not change much at first, but its meaning changed completely. Rooms that had once held routine conversations, shared meals, and the ordinary friction of family life became mental crime scenes that could not be revisited without confronting what had occurred there. Even silence in that space felt altered, no longer peaceful but weighted, as if the walls had absorbed something irreversible. For Paul's children, the passage of time created a strange dual existence in which childhood memories of warmth and stability coexisted with the later, more complicated understanding of betrayal and loss. As they grew older, the story of their father shifted in their minds from something they remembered directly to something they reconstructed through fragments provided by relatives, court records, and public narratives. Each new piece of information forced a reinterpretation of earlier memories, turning what once felt simple into something layered and painful. A father who had once been the center of daily life became a figure partially defined by absence, and that absence became a permanent structure around which adulthood was built. They learned to navigate milestones without him, weddings without his presence, achievements without his acknowledgement, and in each of those moments the question of what might have been lingered quietly in the background, never fully answered. For those who investigated the case, the passage of years did not erase the mental imprint of the crime scene. Detectives who had worked on the initial discovery and interviews often found that certain details resurfaced unexpectedly, not as dramatic memories but as small, persistent images that returned in quiet moments. The position of the car, the condition of the body, the early inconsistencies in testimony, and the gradual realization that the most trusted narrative could also be the most deceptive all became part of a professional memory that shaped how they approached future cases. The Lacy investigation became a reference point, not because it was unique in its violence, but because it demonstrated how domestic environments can mask lethal intent until it is too late to recognize the pattern. It reinforced a lesson that experience alone cannot always prevent deception, because the most convincing lies are often built from elements of truth. In the broader community, the case slowly transformed from a shocking event into a cautionary example, discussed in quieter conversations about trust, marriage, and the hidden dynamics that can exist behind closed doors. People who once spoke about the tragedy with disbelief began, over time, To reflect on it in more personal terms, considering how well they truly know the people closest to them, and whether stability is sometimes only an appearance maintained through unspoken compromise. The idea that violence could emerge from within a long-established relationship challenged assumptions about safety and familiarity, forcing a reconsideration of how emotional harm develops gradually rather than suddenly. It became easier, in hindsight, to identify the financial stress, emotional distance, and relational tension described in testimony, but what remained difficult was accepting that these factors had coexisted for years without intervention or external visibility. In prison, the individuals convicted in the case continued their sentences in environments that reduced their lives to routine and separation from the outside world. Over time, the urgency of their original motivations faded into institutional memory, replaced by the repetitive structure of incarceration. Yet even within confinement, the psychological weight of the case did not disappear. For those involved, the story of what happened in that house remained fixed in a way that could not be reinterpreted or undone. Time did not erase responsibility, but it did alter how that responsibility was carried internally, becoming something less immediate but no less permanent. Meanwhile, the legal resolution of the case, while definitive in terms of verdicts and sentencing, never fully resolved the emotional complexity surrounding it. The courtroom had established accountability in a structured way, assigning degrees of culpability and separating roles among those involved, yet the human reality behind those legal distinctions remained more tangled. The presence of multiple participants, differing confessions, and conflicting narratives meant that even after conviction, questions about intention, influence, and psychological control continued to linger in the background of public understanding. This ambiguity is often what separates legal closure from emotional closure, because the law requires categorization, while human behavior often resists it. For those who loved Paul, the passage of time did not diminish the sense of loss so much as it reshaped its texture. Grief evolved from an immediate shock into a quieter, more constant presence, something that surfaced in unexpected moments rather than remaining at the surface of daily life. Memories of him did not fade, but they became intertwined with awareness of how his life ended, creating a layered emotional experience in which joy and sorrow could no longer be fully separated. His presence was preserved in stories, photographs, and recollections, but always with the awareness that those memories now existed alongside knowledge that fundamentally changed their meaning. In reflecting on the broader implications of the case, it becomes clear that its significance lies not only in the crime itself, but in what it reveals about the fragility of trust and the complexity of long-term relationships under strain. It illustrates how emotional dynamics can evolve slowly over years, creating conditions in which resentment, dependency, and miscommunication accumulate without clear resolution. It also highlights how individuals can occupy multiple roles within a single relational system, shifting between caregiver, partner, confidant, and adversary depending on context and circumstance. These shifting roles can obscure the development of danger until it manifests in irreversible ways. The final lingering truth of the Lacy case is not a simple moral lesson but an uncomfortable recognition that ordinary life can contain extraordinary rupture without external warning. The structures that people rely on for stability, marriage, family, and trust are not inherently protective unless maintained with honesty and mutual respect, and even then they remain vulnerable to breakdown when communication fails and emotional distance grows unchecked. What happened in Schenectady is not remembered because it was rare in its emotional architecture, but because it exposed something that can exist anywhere: the slow erosion of safety within spaces that are assumed to be secure. In the end, the story does not conclude with resolution but with endurance, as those left behind continue to carry forward the memory of what was lost, not as a fixed narrative, but as an evolving understanding of how deeply human relationships can affect both life and death. In the final reflection on the Lacy case, what remains most striking is not only the brutality of the act itself but the slow psychological architecture that made it possible. An architecture built over years of shared history, financial pressure, emotional distance, and the gradual reshaping of intimacy into something unrecognizable. Long after the courtroom doors closed and the formal language of verdicts and sentencing faded into records and archives, the deeper questions continued to circulate quietly among those who studied the case, because the most unsettling aspect was not how quickly violence occurred, but how long it remained hidden inside a life that appeared, from the outside, to be successful and even admirable. The couple had built a public identity rooted in stability and achievement, a narrative of perseverance that many in their community admired. And yet behind that narrative there were fractures that never fully healed, only adapted and shifted shape over time. What investigators later came to understand was that the emotional ecosystem of the marriage had become increasingly imbalanced, not in one dramatic moment, but in a series of incremental adjustments where dissatisfaction, resentment, and unmet expectations accumulated without resolution. These conditions did not automatically lead to violence, but they created a space where trust could be manipulated, and where moral boundaries could be gradually redefined by those willing to justify them. In examining the psychological profiles that emerged from testimony and confession, a pattern becomes visible that is often present in cases of domestic betrayal. The coexistence of dependence and resentment within the same relational structure, where individuals rely on one another for stability while simultaneously feeling trapped by the very arrangement that provides it. This contradiction can distort decision-making over time, especially when external pressures such as financial strain and personal ambition intensify the emotional volatility already present within the household. In the Lacy case, these pressures did not exist in isolation. They interacted with personal vulnerabilities and interpersonal dynamics that were not visible to outsiders, creating a closed environment where distorted rationalizations could take hold without immediate challenge. One of the most difficult aspects for investigators and later analysts to reconcile was how ordinary the surface of the relationship appeared compared to the severity of what unfolded beneath it. This contrast is often what makes such cases psychologically compelling and socially disturbing, because it disrupts the assumption that extreme outcomes must be preceded by equally visible warning signs. Instead, what emerges is a picture of gradual normalization, where concerning behaviors are absorbed into the rhythm of daily life and reinterpreted as temporary stress responses rather than indicators of deeper risk. Over time, this normalization can dull perception, not only for those inside the relationship but also for those around them, who may notice fragments of tension but lack the full context needed to interpret their significance. The investigation itself also reflects the limitations of perception in real time, where early narratives are shaped by incomplete information, and where initial assumptions, however reasonable, can obscure alternative explanations. In the early stages, attention naturally focused on disappearance patterns, financial stress, and possible external involvement, because these frameworks aligned with familiar investigative categories. Only as inconsistencies accumulated did the narrative begin to shift toward internal relational dynamics, revealing how crucial it is in such cases to remain open to multiple interpretations until physical and forensic evidence narrows the field. Even then, the process of reconstructing intent remains inherently complex, because intent is not a static element, but something that evolves through conversation, suggestion, pressure, and individual interpretation. This fluidity is what makes multi-person domestic cases particularly challenging, as responsibility is rarely distributed in a simple or linear way. Each participant may construct a version of events that minimizes their own agency while emphasizing the influence of others, resulting in overlapping accounts that require careful disentanglement. What ultimately emerges is not a single narrative of causation, but a layered structure of participation, where influence and decision-making are distributed across time and relationships. From a broader societal perspective, the case also serves as a reminder of how easily public perception can be shaped by outward appearances of success. The image of a stable family, financial achievement, and community respect can create a protective narrative that discourages deeper inquiry into private distress. This phenomenon is not unique to this case, but it becomes especially visible when contrasted with the outcome, because it forces a reconsideration of how much weight is given to external indicators of well-being. It also raises difficult questions about the thresholds at which concern becomes intervention, and whether social systems are equipped to recognize relational deterioration before it escalates into irreversible harm. For those closest to the victim, however, these analytical frameworks are secondary to the enduring emotional reality of loss. The passage of time does not eliminate absence. It only changes its form. What begins as acute grief gradually becomes a quieter presence, woven into daily life in ways that are both persistent and unpredictable. Certain memories remain vivid, while others fade, but the knowledge of how life ended creates a permanent layer over all recollections, altering their emotional texture. This is one of the most difficult aspects of surviving such a case, because memory itself becomes divided between what was known at the time and what was learned later, and reconciling those two versions of the past is an ongoing process rather than a completed one. In reflecting on the legacy of the Lacy case, it is important to recognize that its significance extends beyond the individuals directly involved. It highlights the complexity of human relationships under pressure and the ways in which emotional, financial, and psychological factors can intersect in unpredictable ways. It also underscores the importance of careful, methodical investigation in cases where initial appearances may be misleading, and where the truth must be reconstructed from fragments that do not immediately align. Above all, it serves as a reminder that behind every case file are lives that were fully lived before they became defined by a single event, and that understanding those lives requires attention not only to how they ended, but to how they were shaped over time. The final impression left by the case is not one of closure but of awareness, an awareness that stability can sometimes conceal instability, and that the most dangerous shifts often occur gradually, within spaces that once felt safe. If this case is viewed one last time through the cold lens of reconstruction, stripped of courtroom language and community memory, what remains is a sequence of human decisions unfolding in a confined space where trust had already begun to collapse long before any physical act took place, and where the final outcome was less a sudden explosion than the endpoint of a long, unstable trajectory that no one fully interrupted. The reconstruction begins not with the moment of death, but with the hours that preceded it, because in domestic homicide investigations the most critical truths are often hidden in the ordinary continuity of time rather than in the violent endpoint itself. In that household, the day did not initially signal deviation from routine. Conversations moved through familiar topics, tasks were completed in predictable rhythms, and the presence of multiple individuals in the same environment created the illusion of normalcy. Yet beneath that surface, small divergences in behavior began to accumulate, subtle shifts in attention, in timing, in who entered which room and when, all of which only became significant in hindsight when aligned against the known outcome. What investigators later emphasized was that the spatial dynamics of the house itself played an important role in how events unfolded. Movement between floors, visibility between rooms, and the separation of private versus shared spaces created conditions where interaction could occur without continuous oversight, allowing for moments of isolation that would later become critical in reconstructing responsibility. The sequence of events that followed cannot be understood as a single uninterrupted action but rather as a chain of interactions, each dependent on the previous one, where intention and execution became intertwined through rapid decision-making under conditions that would later be described in testimony and confession. One of the most important aspects of the reconstruction is the recognition that perception at the time was fragmented. Each individual present experienced only partial awareness of what was occurring, filtered through personal assumptions and emotional states that limited the ability to interpret emerging danger. This fragmentation is crucial in understanding how the situation escalated without immediate external interruption, because it demonstrates how multiple actors can occupy the same environment while holding different interpretations of what is happening in real time. As the timeline narrows toward the critical moment, the reconstruction highlights how quickly ordinary actions can be repurposed into mechanisms of concealment. Objects within the environment, clothing, transportation, and communication devices all transition from neutral elements of daily life into components of post-event staging, not because they were inherently linked to violence, but because they became necessary in shaping the narrative that would follow. This transformation is often one of the most psychologically revealing aspects of such cases, because it shows how the aftermath is not merely a reaction but part of the event itself, constructed almost simultaneously with the act it seeks to obscure. In analyzing the movement of the body after death, investigators emphasize the logistical choices required to relocate it, noting that such actions demand coordination, physical effort, and a level of composure that contrasts sharply with the emotional volatility often assumed in violent incidents. This disconnect between expectation and behavior is a recurring theme in forensic psychology, where the presence of planning or post-event organization can indicate that decision-making did not end at the moment of violence, but continued afterward in a structured way. The reconstruction also considers the role of communication during this period, particularly how information was shared, withheld, or altered between individuals in order to maintain consistency in external narratives. These communications, later compared across interviews, revealed patterns of alignment and divergence that became central to establishing credibility and identifying contradictions. What emerges from this analysis is not a single uninterrupted story of intent, but a shifting alignment of partial truths, where each participant contributed fragments that only formed a coherent picture when assembled retrospectively by investigators. Another critical element in the reconstruction is the psychological transition that occurs when individuals move from passive involvement to active participation in concealment. This transition is rarely instantaneous. It often occurs through incremental decisions that gradually reduce the perceived moral distance between observation and action. Once that threshold is crossed, subsequent decisions tend to follow a path of rationalization, where each step is justified by the need to maintain consistency with previous steps, creating a self-reinforcing cycle of behavior. In this case, that cycle became particularly significant because it extended beyond the initial act and into the shaping of the narrative presented to authorities, which required sustained coordination and emotional suppression over time. From an investigative standpoint, the reconstruction underscores the importance of physical evidence in resolving contradictions between accounts. Forensic indicators such as body position, absence or presence of expected artifacts, and environmental inconsistencies provided anchors against which verbal statements could be measured. These anchors allowed investigators to identify where memory was incomplete, where statements were deliberately altered, and where certain details could not logically coexist. It is within these discrepancies that the most reliable insights often emerge, because physical evidence does not shift under pressure or adaptation, unlike human recollection. As the reconstruction approaches its conclusion, attention turns to the broader implications of the case structure itself. It illustrates how domestic environments can become closed systems in which behavior is not easily visible to external observers, and where escalation can occur without triggering external intervention. It also demonstrates how relational complexity can obscure simple categorization of motive, since financial strain, emotional dissatisfaction, and interpersonal dependency can coexist in ways that produce unpredictable outcomes. Ultimately, what this final reconstruction reveals is not only how the event occurred, but how many different conditions had to align for it to become possible at all. Each factor alone would not have been sufficient, but together they formed a convergence that narrowed the range of possible outcomes until only one remained. In that sense, the case is less about a single decision point and more about a sequence of narrowing possibilities, where each choice reduced the distance between conflict and irreversible consequence. What remains after reconstructing the timeline is a clear but unsettling understanding that the final moment was not isolated from the life that preceded it, but deeply embedded within it, shaped by years of interaction that gradually altered perception, trust, and judgment until the outcome became possible within the ordinary flow of daily existence.